maid's daughter was forced to dance at a talent show as a joke, but her performance shocked everyone. The auditorium was full of lights, laughter, and the quiet expectation of an easy joke. "Come on, let her try," someone smirked. Another voice added, "It'll be priceless." They thought the maid's daughter would stumble, that her faded dress and quiet eyes would tell the story of failure before she even moved. No one asked where she came from or what her silence carried. No one thought to wonder why she danced. But behind every movement was a history buried deep, a legacy whispered through generations. What they planned as humiliation would become something else entirely. What started as a cruel setup ended as an unforgettable moment. This is the story of how a girl they underestimated walked onto a stage meant to break her, only to rewrite everything. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. They thought a little girl in a faded dress would be a perfect joke, but they had no idea who she was or the story her feet were about to tell. They expected her to fail for their amusement. They never expected her to change everything. The single-floor lamp in the corner of the living room cast long, tired shadows across the apartment. It was a small space, but Susan Miller made it a home. Every worn piece of furniture was clean, every blanket folded. Through the thin walls, she could hear the gentle thumping from her daughter's room. It was a familiar rhythm, the sound of stockinged feet moving across the old wooden floor. It was the sound of 12-year-old Clara dancing. Susan smiled, a quiet, weary expression that held a universe of love. She knew Clara only danced like this when she thought no one was watching, when the world was asleep and she could be free. Clara had her father's grace. Susan saw it every day. He had been a carpenter, a man who worked with his hands, but he moved with a dancer's lightness. He used to waltz Susan around this very living room, humming off-key, his laughter filling the small space. He was gone now, taken by a sudden illness 5 years ago, leaving a hole in their lives that Susan was still trying to patch over. All Clara had left of him were a few faded photographs and a deep, unspoken love for movement and music that had blossomed in his absence. The thumping in the other room stopped. A moment later, Clara appeared in the doorway, her face flushed and her fine, blonde hair clinging to her forehead. She was small for her age, with serious blue eyes that seemed to see more than most children did. "Did I wake you, Mom?" she asked, her voice soft. "Never," Susan said, patting the spot next to her on the sofa. "I was just finishing up some mending. Come, sit with me." Clara curled up beside her mother, leaning her head against Susan's arm. They didn't need to say much. This quiet comfort was the bedrock of their world, a fortress against the difficulties that waited outside their door each morning. For Susan, the morning meant putting on her simple uniform and taking 2 buses to the Harrington estate, a world of marble floors and careless wealth where she worked as a housekeeper. For Clara, it meant school, where she was a quiet, observant student who always felt slightly out of step with the other children. "Mrs. Harrington was talking about the talent show again today," Susan said, her fingers deftly working the needle through a tear in Clara's school uniform. "Madison is very excited. They've hired a choreographer from the city for her." Clara nodded, tracing the floral pattern on the sofa with her finger. Madison Harrington was also 12. She lived in a house that looked like a castle, had a pony, and took lessons for everything: piano, French, and especially dance. Clara had seen her practice in the family's private studio, a room with floor-to-ceiling mirrors and a polished bar. Madison's movements were precise, drilled into her by expensive tutors, but to Clara's watchful eye, they seemed to lack a heart. "Her costume arrived today," Susan continued, her voice carefully neutral. "It came in a very large box. Covered in crystals, I think." Clara said nothing. She knew what her mother was doing. Susan was preparing her, in her gentle way, for the unavoidable comparisons that would come. It was a conversation they had in pieces most evenings. A story about the Harringtons' vacation plans, or a new car, or a thoughtless comment made by Mrs. Harrington. Each story was a small stone placed on the wall between their life and the Harringtons' life, a wall Clara felt more acutely every time she visited the grand house where her mother worked. The next afternoon, that wall crumbled. Susan had been called to stay late to help with preparations for a garden party. Clara, let out of school early, came to the estate to wait for her mother, as she sometimes did. She was told to stay in the kitchen, to be invisible, but the sound of music drew her out. It was coming from the grand ballroom, a room larger than their entire apartment. Peeking through the crack in the tall, mahogany doors, Clara saw Madison practicing her routine for the upcoming America's Next Star youth talent show. Madison twirled across the floor, her movements sharp and aggressive. Her mother, Elizabeth Harrington, sat on a velvet chair, her face a mask of critical focus. No, Madison, she snapped. Your extension is lazy. Again. Madison huffed, spinning again. As she turned, she caught a glimpse of blonde hair in the doorway. Mother, the maid's daughter is watching me. Elizabeth Harrington's head whipped around. Her eyes, cold and sharp, landed on Clara. What are you doing? I thought I told your mother you were to remain in the kitchen. Clara froze, her heart pounding. I'm sorry, ma'am. I heard the music. Mrs. Harrington stood up, her silk dress rustling. She walked over to Clara, looking her up and down with an expression of faint disgust. Clara was wearing her school clothes, a simple skirt and a blouse Susan had mended twice. She felt herself shrink under the woman's gaze. She looks like a little stray, doesn't she? Mrs. Harrington said to the room at large. Madison giggled. Then, a strange, cruel idea began to form on Elizabeth Harrington's face. Her thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. You like to dance, little girl? Clara could only nod, her throat tight. Well, you're in luck, Mrs. Harrington said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. The talent show is a wonderful community event. It's all about participation, about giving everyone a chance to shine. She turned back to her daughter. Madison, darling, wouldn't it be a wonderful gesture of charity if we sponsored Clara's entry into the competition? A wonderful story for the producers. The privileged girl and the maid's daughter, dancing on the same stage. It's perfect. Madison's eyes lit up with malicious glee. Oh yes, mother. We could even help her with a costume. She eyed Clara's simple clothes with theatrical pity. Clara's mind raced. Get on a stage? In front of hundreds of people? The thought was a physical pain, a knot of terror in her stomach. Oh, no, I couldn't, she whispered. I'm not. I don't have a routine. Nonsense, Mrs. Harrington purred, placing a heavy hand on Clara's shoulder. We'll take care of everything. I'll call the producer myself. They love these little human interest stories. My husband is a major sponsor of the event. They won't say no. Just then, Susan entered the ballroom, a tray of polished silver in her hands. She saw her daughter standing frozen under Mrs. Harrington's hand, saw the look on Madison's face, and understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. Is there a problem, Mrs. Harrington? Susan asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her gut. No problem at all, Susan, Elizabeth said, her smile widening. In fact, we have wonderful news. We're going to sponsor Clara's entry into the talent show with Madison. Isn't that just a wonderful opportunity for her? Susan looked at Clara's terrified face, then back at the triumphant expression of her employer. She saw the trap for what it was. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a spectacle. A joke designed to make her daughter a punchline, a sad little footnote in Madison Harrington's story of success. But she was trapped. Her job paid for their rent, for their food, for the roof over Clara's head. A single word of refusal, a hint of protest, and it could all be gone. With a heavy heart that felt like it was sinking through the floor, Susan forced a tight smile. That's very generous of you, ma'am. Excellent, Mrs. Harrington declared, clapping her hands together softly. It's settled, then. The preliminary auditions are in 3 days. We'll see you there, Clara. She steered her own daughter away, whispering, This will be simply priceless. Susan rushed to her daughter's side, kneeling down to look into her eyes. Clara, honey, look at me. You don't have to do this. But you'll lose your job, Clara whispered back, tears welling in her eyes. I heard what she said. Her husband is a sponsor. Susan pulled her daughter into a fierce hug, burying her face in Clara's hair. The smell of bargain shampoo was a comfort, a small anchor in a sea of helplessness. We will figure this out, she murmured, though she had no idea how. We always do. That night, their small apartment felt more like a cage. Clara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the cruel laughter of Madison and her mother echoing in her ears. She felt a familiar despair creep in, the same feeling she'd had after her father passed. a sense of the world being too big, too loud, and too unkind. She didn't want to dance on a stage. Dancing was her secret. It was the one thing that was hers alone, a silent conversation between her body and the music, a way to speak when words failed. To do it in front of them, for their laughter, felt like a violation. She heard her mother moving around in the living room and knew she wasn't sleeping either. A few minutes later, Susan appeared at her door, holding a dusty, wooden box. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice gentle. She sat on the edge of Clara's bed and opened the lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed tissue paper, was a black and white photograph of a young man in a soldier's uniform, a pair of tarnished dog tags, and a folded, brittle newspaper clipping. "You know this is your great-grandfather, George Miller," Susan said, handing the photograph to Clara. The man in the picture was young, with a serious but kind face and eyes that looked remarkably like Clara's. "You've told me he was a war hero," Clara said quietly. "He was," Susan confirmed. "He fought in a terrible war, saw things no one should ever have to see. People called him Ironclad Miller because they said nothing could break him. But that's not the whole story." She carefully unfolded the newspaper clipping. The headline was in a language Clara didn't recognize, with a faded picture of a man on a stage, caught mid-leap. He was a dancer, a ballet dancer. His face was the same as the soldiers. Before the war, before he came to this country and changed his name to hide, he was someone else, Susan explained. His name was Mikhail Petrov, and he was a famous dancer in Russia. They said he was one of the best of his generation. But the war took everything from him. His home, his name, his career. He came here with nothing and started over. He never danced on a stage again. Clara stared at the image, her heart beating a little faster. A dancer. This stoic war hero, this legend in their family, had been a dancer. He never talked about it, Susan continued, her voice filled with a distant sadness. But his wife, your great-grandmother, said that sometimes, late at night, she would find him in the yard, moving under the moonlight. He could not dance. It was in his blood. It was who he was. Susan picked up the old, worn dog tags. The name stamped into the metal was G. Miller. He was brave, Clara. Not just because he was a soldier. He was brave because he lost everything and he still found a way to build a new life. He faced things that were much scarier than a stage with some bright lights. She pressed the dog tags into Clara's palm. The metal was cool against her skin. When you feel scared, you hold on to this. And you remember his story. You are not just a maid's daughter, Clara. You are the great-granddaughter of Ironclad Miller. There is steel in you that the Harringtons could never understand. Clara closed her fingers around the dog tags, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. She looked from the photo of the soldier to the clipping of the dancer. For the first time that day, the knot of fear in her stomach loosened, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of something else. Something like courage. She didn't know if she could do this. But now, she knew she had to try. Not for the Harringtons, not for the show, but for the silent dancer who lived on in her blood. The next day, Susan called the production office of America's Next Star to confirm Clara's participation. The man on the phone was named Mark Jennings. He sounded slick and overly enthusiastic. "Susan, wonderful to hear from you," he boomed, as if they were old friends. "Elizabeth Harrington has told me all about your little Clara. What a heartwarming story. It's exactly the kind of thing our audience loves. The underdog, the dream against all odds. It's ratings gold." Susan's stomach turned. "Clara is a very shy girl, Mr. Jennings. She's not used to any of this." "Don't you worry about a thing," Mark said with a practiced chuckle. "We'll take great care of her. Just get her to the studio tomorrow for the pre-show interviews and a quick rehearsal. We want to capture all that raw, authentic emotion." Susan knew what raw, authentic emotion meant. They wanted to film her daughter's fear. They wanted to package her poverty and her shyness into a 2-minute segment designed to make the audience feel a mix of pity and superiority before they cast her aside. She hung up the phone, her hand trembling slightly. This was so much worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just Mrs. Harrington's private joke anymore. Now, they were going to broadcast it to the entire city. When she told Clara, the girl's face went pale. "Interviews? They want to ask me questions. We'll get through it together," Susan said, trying to inject a confidence into her voice that she did not feel. "We'll just tell the truth. That you love to dance. That's all." She helped Clara pick out an outfit for the next day. The options were limited. They settled on a simple blue dress, one of the few Clara owned that wasn't a hand-me-down. Susan had sewn it herself for a school recital 2 years ago. It was neat and clean, but next to the designer clothes of the other contestants, she knew it would look plain and homemade. Susan stayed up late that night, carefully ironing the dress and sewing a small, hidden pocket on the inside, just big enough for a pair of old dog tags. The television studio was a sprawling, intimidating building of glass and steel. Inside, it was a chaotic maze of corridors, sound stages, and brightly lit rooms filled with people rushing around with clipboards and headsets. A young intern with pink hair and a perpetually stressed expression met them at the reception desk. "Clara Miller?" she asked, not looking up from her phone. "Mark's waiting for you in interview room B. Mom, you can wait in the green room. Down the hall to the left." Separating them was the first move. Susan squeezed Clara's hand tightly. "You'll be fine. Just be yourself. I'm right down the hall." Clara nodded, clutching the dog tags in her hidden pocket. The intern led her into a small, dark room where several cameras were pointed at a single empty chair. Mark Jennings sat opposite it, looking predatory under the harsh lights. He was younger than he sounded on the phone, with perfectly styled hair and a smile that was all teeth. "Clara, welcome," he exclaimed, standing to greet her. "Come, have a seat. Don't be nervous. This is just a friendly chat." Clara sat, the heat from the lights making her feel dizzy. A technician clipped a microphone to the collar of her dress. "So, Clara," Mark began, leaning forward conspiratorially once the cameras were rolling. "Tell me, what's it like for a girl like you to be in a place like this? It must be a dream come true." Clara swallowed. "It's very big," she said. "I'll bet." Mark chuckled. "And Mrs. Harrington sponsored your entry. What a wonderful woman. It must be incredible, having your mother work in a place like that, seeing how the other half lives." Every question was a thinly veiled reference to her family's poverty. He asked what her apartment was like. He asked if she was friends with Madison. He asked if she had ever had professional dance lessons. With each question, he was painting a picture for the audience, the poor, untalented charity case. Clara gave short, quiet answers, her voice barely a whisper. She refused to cry, refused to give him the dramatic tears he was so obviously fishing for. In her pocket, her fingers traced the letters on her great-grandfather's name. Finally, Mark leaned back, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. She wasn't giving him the sound bites he wanted. "Okay, Clara. Last question. Madison is a very talented, highly trained dancer. What makes you think you can compete with her?" Clara looked directly into the camera for the first time. She thought of her mother, working tirelessly to keep them afloat. She thought of her father, waltzing her mother around their tiny living room. And she thought of the dancer, the soldier, the man who had survived so much more than this. "I don't think about competing with Madison," she said, her voice small but clear. "When I dance, I'm just telling a story." The answer was so simple, so unexpected, that Mark was momentarily silenced. He quickly recovered, ending the interview with another plastic smile. "Wonderful. That's just wonderful. Now, let's get you to the rehearsal stage." The rehearsal was even more humiliating. The stage was vast and empty. A few bored-looking technicians lounged in the front rows. Madison was there with her mother, stretching imperiously in a corner. She was wearing a professional-looking leotard and leggings. Clara, in her simple blue school dress, felt like a ghost. "Okay, little star, show us what you've got," Mark said, gesturing to the center of the stage. "What's your music?" I brought a CD," Clara said, holding it out. It was a piece of classical music her father had loved, a powerful, melancholic cello suite. Mark glanced at it with a smirk. "Ambitious. Okay, hit it, Gary." The soaring notes of the cello filled the empty auditorium. Clara took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and tried to dance. But she couldn't. Her limbs felt heavy, her feet glued to the floor. She was acutely aware of every set of eyes on her. She could feel the judgment from the technicians, the smug amusement from Mark, the pure contempt from the Harringtons. She stumbled through a few hesitant steps, her arms stiff at her sides, a clumsy, awkward imitation of the fluid grace she felt in the privacy of her room. After a minute, Mark cut the music. "Okay, that's a start," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Very emotional. We'll work on it." He turned to Madison. "Madison, Honey, you're up. Show our little friend how it's done. Madison strutted to the center of the stage. Her music, a loud, bombastic pop track, blared from the speakers. She launched into her routine, a flurry of high kicks, sharp turns, and dramatic poses. It was technically proficient, but utterly devoid of feeling. It was a performance designed to impress, not to move. Mrs. Harrington clapped loudly. Bravo, my star. Clara watched from the shadows of the stage wing, her cheeks burning with shame. This was their plan. To put her on display right after Madison, to make the contrast as jarring and cruel as possible. Mark walked over to her, patting her on the shoulder with false sympathy. Don't worry, kid, he whispered, leaning in close. The audience loves a trier. Just go out there and be yourself. Your story is what matters, not the fancy moves. They'll love you for your heart. It was the same hollow encouragement he'd given Beatrice in the source story. A lie wrapped in a compliment. Clara knew then, with absolute certainty, that he didn't want her to succeed. He wanted her to be a pathetic, lovable failure. As she and her mother rode the bus home in silence, the city lights blurring past the window, Clara felt a cold resolve settle over her. They thought they knew who she was. They had written her story before she even had a chance to tell it. They were all wrong. Susan held her daughter's hand, her own thoughts a turbulent storm of anger and fear. She was angry at the casual cruelty of the Harringtons, at the smirking producer, and most of all, at her own powerlessness. To protect her child, she had been forced to lead her into this public humiliation. The guilt was a physical weight on her shoulders. When they arrived back at their small, quiet apartment, the familiar space offered little comfort. It felt fragile, as if the harshness of the outside world had followed them in and settled in the corners. Clara went straight to her room without a word and gently closed the door. Susan stood in the living room, listening. She didn't hear the familiar, soft thumps of Clara dancing. She heard only silence, and it was a sound that broke her heart. Later, she heated up some soup for dinner, a simple vegetable broth that was usually one of Clara's favorites. She knocked softly on her daughter's door. Clara, honey, dinner's ready. The door opened a crack. Clara's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. I'm not hungry, Mom. Just a little, Susan urged gently. You need to keep your strength up. Clara came out and sat at the small kitchen table, staring into the bowl of soup as if it were an impossible puzzle. She pushed a piece of carrot around with her spoon. I can't do it, she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't go back there. When I was on that stage, I forgot everything. I forgot how to move. I just stood there while they all stared at me. Madison, she was laughing. I know, Susan said, her voice aching with sympathy. She reached across the table and covered Clara's hand with her own. What they are doing is wrong, Clara. It's mean, and it's unfair. Then why do we have to do it? Clara asked, a tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. Why can't we just say no? Susan took a deep, shaky breath. She had to be honest. Because I am afraid, honey. I'm afraid of losing my job. I'm afraid of not being able to pay the rent or buy our food. That's the truth. And it makes me feel ashamed to say it, but it's the truth. She squeezed Clara's hand. But my fear isn't your fault, and you don't have to carry it for me. They sat in silence for a long time, the soup growing cold between them. Clara eventually went back to her room, and again, there was no sound of dancing. Susan cleaned the kitchen on autopilot, her movements slow and heavy. This quiet, defeated version of her daughter was a stranger. Clara's dance had always been her joy, her escape. To see it stolen from her, turned into a weapon to be used against her, was an unbearable cruelty. The next day was the final technical rehearsal before the live show. The dread in the apartment was a tangible thing. Clara barely spoke as she got dressed, choosing the same simple blue dress. It felt like a costume for a part she never wanted to play. As she reached for the doorknob, she hesitated. Susan saw the fear in her daughter's eyes, the way her shoulders slumped in defeat. Wait a moment, she said. She went to the wooden box and took out the photograph of her great-grandfather, the dancer. She didn't say anything. She simply propped it up on the little table by the door, right where Clara would see it as she left. The young man in the photo seemed to look back at them, his gaze steady and calm. It was a silent reminder. The atmosphere at the studio was even more frantic than before. Contestants and their parents bustled through the hallways, a nervous, electric energy in the air. Mark Jennings greeted Clara with the same false warmth, a camera crew trailing him. "Clara, our little Cinderella," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Ready for your big day tomorrow? We're just going to run the lighting cues. No pressure. Just walk through your routine one more time for us." The Harringtons were already there, holding court near the stage. Mrs. Harrington was speaking to another wealthy-looking mother, gesturing discreetly toward Clara while whispering behind a manicured hand. The other woman glanced over, her expression a mixture of pity and disdain. The poison of their narrative was spreading. Clara walked toward the stage, her feet feeling like lead. This time, she didn't even try to dance. When the music started, she simply walked to her starting position, stood for a moment, and then walked off. She couldn't bring herself to perform for them again, not even in rehearsal. The music played into an empty spotlight on the stage. Mark sighed theatrically. "Stage fright," he said to his cameraman, shaking his head. "Poor kid. It's a lot to handle. Make sure you get a tight shot of her face tomorrow. The audience needs to feel that emotional journey." As Clara walked down the dark corridor leading away from the stage, her head down, a voice cut through her misery. "Hey, kid." She looked up. A young man in a black t-shirt with the show's logo was leaning against the wall. He had kind eyes and a friendly, concerned expression. He was holding a coil of cable. "I'm David," he said. "I work on the sound crew." Clara just nodded, expecting him to mock her like everyone else. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "Don't let them get to you. I've seen them do this before. They find someone they think is an easy target, and they build a whole story around them. The sad story. It's all planned." Clara stared at him, surprised by his honesty. "That producer, Mark, he thinks he's making a movie, and you're his sad little character," David continued. "He wants you to be scared. He wants you to look helpless. That's his sympathetic elimination segment." The phrase hung in the air between them. Sympathetic elimination. That's what she was. A pre-planned failure. "So what do I do?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. David looked around to make sure no one was listening. "When you get out there tomorrow, don't look at them. Not the judges, not the audience, and definitely not the Harringtons. They'll feed off your fear. Instead, find something to look at in the back of the auditorium. A little red exit sign, a light on a camera, anything. Stare at that one spot and dance for it. Don't dance for them. Don't even think about them. Just do what you do in your room when you're all alone. Can you do that?" The advice was so simple, yet it felt like a lifeline. A strategy. It was a way to take back a tiny piece of control. For the first time, Clara felt a flicker of agency in a situation where she had felt completely powerless. "I can try," she said. David smiled, a genuine, encouraging smile. "Good. Now get out of here before Mark sees me talking to you. And hey, break a leg." That night, the eve of the performance, was the longest of Clara's life. She and Susan ate dinner in their usual quiet companionship, but tonight the silence felt different. It was less about sadness and more about a shared, unspoken resolve. After they had cleared the table, Susan brought the wooden box into the living room and sat on the floor, motioning for Clara to join her. She didn't take out the photos this time. Instead, she lifted a false bottom in the box, revealing a hidden compartment. Tucked inside was a pair of old, worn leather ballet slippers. They were cracked with age, the ribbons frayed, but they had clearly been well loved. "These were his," Susan said softly. "Your great-grandmother kept them hidden. He never wanted anyone to know. He was so afraid of being seen as weak, especially after everything he'd been through." Clara reached out and touched the soft leather. It felt almost sacred. "He wasn't weak, though," Susan continued, her eyes distant. "He was the strongest person I ever knew. Not because of what he did in the war, but because of how he lived his life after. When he came to this country, he had nothing. He didn't speak the language. People looked down on him. They called him names. He took the jobs no one else wanted, sweeping floors, digging ditches. But he never complained. And he never, ever let them see him bow his head." She looked directly at Clara, her expression fierce with love. "Dignity, Clara. That's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it to them. What the Harringtons and that man at the studio want is to steal your dignity. They want to turn you into a joke so they can feel powerful. You cannot let them." Clara looked down at her hands, the weight of her mother's words settling deep inside her. "I don't care if you win," Susan said, her voice softening. "I don't care if you get a single clap. All I care about is that when you walk onto that stage tomorrow, you do it with your head held high. You are not their charity case. You are not the maid's daughter. You are Clara Miller, the great-granddaughter of a man who was an artist and a survivor. You stand in your light. You tell your story with your dance, and you let the rest of the world fade away. Whatever happens after that doesn't matter. We will still walk out of there together, with our heads high. The words were a balm on Clara's raw nerves. They shifted something inside her. The goal was no longer to win, or even to dance well. The goal was to endure with grace. The goal was dignity. She picked up the tarnished dog tags and closed them in her fist. Can I wear these tomorrow? They were always yours, Susan said, her eyes shining with tears. Clara went to her room, and for the first time in 2 days, she moved the little rug in the center of her floor. She put on the cello music, the volume turned down low. She didn't practice a routine. She just danced. She let the music fill her, let the stories her mother told her guide her movements. She danced the story of a young artist in a faraway land. She danced the story of a soldier facing his fear. She danced the story of an immigrant building a new life from nothing. She danced her own story of a quiet girl with a secret joy. She danced until the moon was high in the sky, and her small room was no longer a cage, but a stage all her own. And she was not afraid. The day of the show arrived with a cold, gray dawn. The hours leading up to the performance passed in a blur of nervous tension. Susan helped Clara pin her blonde hair back in a simple, elegant bun. Clara wore the blue dress, now ironed to a perfect crispness. Before they left, Susan took a thin silver chain from her own neck. It was the only piece of real jewelry she owned, a gift from Clara's father. She carefully threaded the dog tags onto it and fastened it around Clara's neck, tucking it beneath the collar of the dress so it lay hidden, resting coolly against her skin. "He's with you," Susan whispered, kissing her daughter's forehead. Backstage at the theater was a world of controlled chaos. Dancers in glittering costumes stretched in the hallways. Singers vocalized in corners. A magician practiced a card trick with shaking hands. The air was thick with the smells of hairspray and nervous sweat. The Harringtons had a private dressing room, its door marked with a gold star. Clara and Susan were assigned a spot in a crowded communal area, a corner with 2 chairs and a sliver of a mirror. Madison swept by them at one point, a whirlwind of sequins and tulle, her makeup professionally applied. "Don't smudge the floor with your shoes, Clara," she said with a smirk, before disappearing into her dressing room. Clara ignored her. She sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap, her posture straight and calm. She wasn't the same terrified girl from the rehearsals. She was composed, her expression serious and focused. Susan watched her, marveling at the transformation. The steel she had spoken of was now visible. Mark Jennings bustled over, his fake smile firmly in place. "There she is, our little star. How are you feeling, sweetie?" "Nervous." He had a camera crew with him, eager to capture her last-minute jitters. Clara looked up at him, her blue eyes clear and direct. "I am ready, Mr. Jennings," she said, her voice even. Her composure seemed to throw him off. This didn't fit the narrative of the terrified charity case. He recovered quickly. "That's the spirit. Remember, just have fun with it. America loves authenticity." He patted her on the head, a condescending gesture, and moved on to his next victim. A stage manager with a headset called out places. 5 minutes to showtime. Susan knelt in front of her daughter, taking both of her small hands. "Don't forget what we talked about. This is your story, no one else's." "I won't," Clara promised. Her fingers went to the hidden dog tags beneath her collar, her own private armor. She was the 7th contestant in the lineup, scheduled to go on right after a loud, energetic hip-hop group, and just before Madison Harrington. It was a deliberate choice by the producers, designed to maximize her humiliation. The hip-hop group finished to wild applause, their performance a technical marvel of synchronized movement and acrobatics. Then, the stage went quiet. The host, a man with a dazzling white smile, stepped into the spotlight. "And now, folks, we have a very special story for you," he began, reading from the teleprompter with practiced sincerity. "Our next contestant is here tonight, thanks to the generosity of the Harrington family. She's a little girl with a big dream, whose mother works for the family as a housekeeper. It just goes to show you, it's never too late to chase your dreams. Please give a warm welcome to the very brave, Clara Miller." Polite, slightly pitying applause rippled through the massive auditorium. Clara walked from the wings into the blinding glare of the spotlights. The stage felt 100 miles long. She could feel the weight of thousands of eyes on her, could sense their collective judgment of her simple dress, her lack of professional polish. A camera on a long mechanical arm swooped in close, its red light glowing like a predator's eye. She walked to the center of the stage and stood there, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. The host approached. "Welcome, Clara. It's a big stage. Are you nervous?" "A little," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "Well, we're all so proud of you for being here. What will you be performing for us tonight?" Clara took a quiet breath. "I'm going to dance to Bach's Cello Suite No. 1. A murmur went through the audience and the judges' panel. It was a serious, complex piece of music, a choice so unexpected for a 12-year-old in a talent show that it bordered on absurd. The lead judge, a famous Broadway choreographer known for his sharp tongue, raised an eyebrow. In the control room, Mark Jennings leaned into his microphone, speaking to the director. "Here we go. Get ready with the camera on Mrs. Harrington. I want her patronizing, teary-eyed reaction shot. This is going to be a train wreck. A beautiful, heart-wrenching train wreck." The first notes of the cello began to play, the sound rich and mournful, filling the silent theater. Clara closed her eyes for a single second. She remembered David's advice. When she opened them, she did not look at the judges or the host or the vast, dark sea of faces. She found the small, red exit sign high up in the back of the auditorium, a tiny beacon in the darkness. She fixed her gaze on it. And then, she began to tell her story. Her first movement was not a grand leap or a dramatic twirl. It was a simple, quiet gesture. An unfolding of her arms, a slow rise onto the balls of her feet. It was a movement of awakening, of a story beginning to be told. It was not the clumsy, hesitant stumbling from the rehearsal. This was something else entirely. This was intentional. In the control booth, Mark Jennings leaned forward, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Okay, get a close-up. Let's see the tears." But there were no tears. Clara's face was a mask of intense concentration, her blue eyes fixed on that distant red light. Her body, small and unassuming in the simple blue dress, began to move with a fluidity that was breathtaking. She was not executing steps she had memorized. She was channeling a narrative. Her dance told the story of a young man in a cold, distant land, his movements full of youthful joy and artistic passion. Her arms carved shapes in the air that spoke of soaring ambition, of a life laid out like a grand stage. The lead judge, the famously severe choreographer, slowly sat up straighter in his chair. He took off his glasses, polished them on his jacket, and put them back on, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. This was not the amateurish display he had expected. The girl's technique was unrefined. Yes, she lacked the polished precision of a studio-trained dancer, but she possessed something far rarer. She had an innate, almost primal connection to the music. Every note from the cello seemed to flow through her, not just around her. In the wings, Susan Miller stood with her hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming silently down her face. This was her daughter. This was the secret, beautiful dance she had only ever glimpsed through a cracked door. To see it now, unfurling in all its glory under these harsh, unforgiving lights, was a pain and a joy so profound it stole the air from her lungs. On stage, the tone of the music shifted, becoming darker, more dissonant. Clara's movements changed with it. The joyful leaps were replaced by sharp, angular gestures. Her body coiled and contracted, telling the story of war, of loss, of a world turned upside down. She moved with a ferocity that seemed impossible for a girl her size. She was ironclad Miller on the battlefield, her small frame conveying a story of immense struggle and resilience. She was no longer just a 12-year-old girl. She was a conduit for a history she had never known but had inherited in her very bones. The audience was utterly captivated. The initial pity had evaporated, replaced by a stunned, disbelieving silence. They had been prepared by the host's introduction for a sad, clumsy performance. They had been primed to feel a patronizing sort of sympathy. What they were witnessing was a raw, powerful, and deeply moving piece of performance art. They had come expecting to see a joke. They were being shown a masterpiece. Elizabeth Harrington sat rigid in her front row seat, her smile frozen on her face. This was not happening. This was not the plan. The pathetic little maid's daughter was supposed to trip over her own feet. She was supposed to be a laughable footnote, a moment of comedic relief before her own daughter's triumphant performance. She glanced at her husband, whose usual expression of bored indifference had been replaced by one of genuine fascination. She looked at her daughter, Madison, who was staring at the stage with a look of pure, venomous jealousy. The beautiful, expensive trap they had set was not only failing, it was transforming its intended victim into a star. "What is she doing?" Elizabeth hissed under her breath. In the control booth, Mark Jennings was frantic. "Forget the Harrington shot. Keep the camera on the girl. On her face, on her feet, I don't care. Just stay on her. This is not the story we were selling, but it's 1,000 times better. This is gold, Jerry, pure gold." The final movement of the cello suite began, a melody of profound sorrow, but also of hope and rebirth. Clara's dance transformed once more. The sharp, pained movements softened. She told the story of a journey across an ocean, of a new beginning in a strange land. She danced the quiet dignity of a man sweeping floors, his artist's soul hidden but not extinguished. She danced the strength of a family putting down new roots, of love found in a small, worn apartment. She danced the story of her mother's tireless work, of her father's waltz in the living room. She danced her own story. As the last, long, resonant note of the cello faded into silence, Clara's movements slowed. She ended not in a dramatic, posed finish, but in a position of quiet repose, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her. She stood there, perfectly still, a small, solitary figure in a vast pool of light. For a full 5 seconds, the theater was utterly, completely silent. It was a silence so deep, so absolute, that it felt louder than any applause. It was the sound of thousands of people collectively holding their breath, trying to process what they had just witnessed. They had forgotten they were at a televised talent competition. They had been transported. Then, a single person in the back of the auditorium stood up and started to clap. The sound was like a stone dropped into a still pond. A moment later, another person joined in, then a dozen, then 100, and then the entire theater erupted. It was not the polite, encouraging applause they had given her at the beginning. It was a roar, a thunderous, heartfelt, overwhelming ovation that shook the very foundations of the building. People were on their feet, whistling, cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. Clara lifted her head, and for the first time, she looked out at the audience. She seemed startled by the wall of noise coming at her, as if she were waking from a dream. The host, his professional composure shattered, walked onto the stage, his face a picture of genuine astonishment. He stood beside her, waiting for the applause to die down, but it showed no sign of stopping. The judges were all on their feet, clapping as loudly as anyone. The severe choreographer was beaming, all his earlier cynicism gone. He caught Clara's eye and gave her a sharp, respectful nod. It was the highest praise he could give. Backstage, David, the young sound technician, let out a whoop of triumph, pumping his fist in the air. He had given her a small piece of advice, but she had taken it and built a miracle. In her seat, Elizabeth Harrington was pale with fury. Her perfect plan, her perfect evening, was ruined. She grabbed Madison's arm, her fingers digging in like claws. "You will go out there, and you will be better," she seethed, her voice a venomous whisper. "Do you understand me?" Madison just stared at the stage, at the small girl in the simple blue dress who was being showered with more adoration than Madison, with all her lessons and costumes and privilege, had ever received in her life. For the first time, Madison wasn't just jealous. She was afraid. When the applause finally began to subside, the host held up his microphone. "Clara Miller, everyone," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I think I speak for everyone here when I say, we have just witnessed something truly, truly special." He turned to her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Clara, where did you learn to dance like that?" Clara looked out at the sea of faces, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange, exhilarating new feeling. She touched the chain hidden beneath her collar. "It's a family story," she said, her voice clear and strong, broadcast to millions. The host, sensing a powerful moment, gestured for her to continue. "Tell us." "My great-grandfather," she began, her gaze steady, "was a dancer. A famous one, in his home country. but he lost everything in a war. He came here with nothing but the clothes on his back and the name on his dog tags. He never danced on a stage again. He worked hard. He built a new life, and he was a hero. But he never let go of who he was. She looked directly into the main camera, as if speaking to someone far away. He taught me that you don't have to have a big stage to be a dancer. You just have to have a story to tell. Her words, so simple and profound, landed with the force of a revelation. In the audience, her mother, Susan, sobbed openly, her heart fit to burst with love and pride. She saw not just her daughter in that spotlight, but the ghost of a forgotten artist, finally getting his due. She saw the quiet strength of her husband and the dignity of generations of millers who had worked hard and lived honest lives. In that moment, her daughter had given them all a voice. The judges were next to give their feedback, but it was clear this was a mere formality. The Broadway choreographer spoke first. "In my 30 years in this business," he said, his voice raspy with emotion, "I have seen the most technically perfect dancers in the world. I have seen performers who can execute a routine with the precision of a surgeon. But I have rarely, if ever, seen a soul dance. Tonight, we all saw a soul dance. That was not a talent show performance. That was art. Pure, unadorned, magnificent art." The other judges echoed his sentiments, showering her with praise that was both effusive and sincere. They were no longer speaking to a contestant. They were speaking to an artist. After the judges' comments, it was Madison Harrington's turn to perform. She walked onto the stage in a costume that was a riot of pink feathers and sparkling crystals, a strained smile plastered on her face. Her loud, generic pop music started, and she launched into her highly rehearsed routine. Her kicks were high, her turns were fast, her smile was wide. But the performance, which moments before would have seemed impressive, now felt hollow and empty. It was a series of gymnastic tricks set to music. It had no story, no heart, no soul. It was a perfect, polished, expensive shell. The audience applauded politely when she finished, a lukewarm ripple of sound that was a stark, brutal contrast to the thunderous ovation they had given Clara. Madison took her bow, her smile faltering at the corners, and walked off the stage, her eyes burning with humiliation. Her mother met her in the wings, her face a mask of cold fury. The joke had been on them, after all. The rest of the show passed in a daze for Clara. When it came time to announce the winner, there was no suspense. The host ripped open the envelope with a flourish. The winner of this year's America's Next Star competition is Clara Miller. Confetti cannons exploded, showering the stage in glittering paper. The host handed Clara a ridiculously oversized check and a large, shiny trophy. The audience was on its feet again, their applause deafening. Clara stood in the center of the glittering storm, holding the trophy, her mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the moment. She looked to the wings and saw her mother. Susan was not looking at the trophy or the check. She was looking at her daughter's face, and her own face was radiant with a light that outshone all the stage lights in the world. As the show ended and the cameras were turned off, a crowd of people rushed the stage. They weren't producers or stagehands. They were members of the audience, parents, and other contestants, all wanting to congratulate her, to tell her how much her performance had moved them. She was surrounded by a sea of smiling, friendly faces. Through the crowd, she saw Mark Jennings pushing his way toward her, a contract and a pen in his hand, his face alight with opportunistic greed. But before he could reach her, another figure stepped in front of him, blocking his path. It was the lead judge, the famous choreographer. "Don't you dare," the judge said to Mark, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare try to lock this girl into one of your exploitative, dead-end contracts. She is a genuine artist. She deserves better than you." Mark stammered, taken aback, but the choreographer was formidable. He turned his back on the producer and knelt in front of Clara. "Young lady," he said, his voice now gentle, "my name is Arthur Vance. I have a school, a real one, in New York. It's for gifted young people like you. I would be honored, truly honored, if you would consider accepting a full scholarship. We can help you train, help you hone this incredible gift you have. There would be no cost to you or your mother. We would take care of everything." Clara was speechless. New York, a real school, a scholarship. It was a world she couldn't have even imagined yesterday. She looked to her mother, who had finally made it through the crowd to her side. Susan wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tight. "It's your choice, honey," Susan whispered into her hair. "Whatever you want to do." Clara looked at the kind, serious face of Mr. Vance. She looked at the giant, silly check in her hand. She looked at the gleaming trophy. And she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that nothing would ever be the same. The week that had started with a cruel joke had ended with a miracle. They had tried to make her a punchline, but she had changed the story. She had told her own, and it was only just beginning. 6 months later, the crisp spring air of New York City felt like a different planet from the world they had left behind. From the window of their modest but clean two-bedroom apartment in Queens, Clara could see a sliver of the skyline, a jagged line of silver and glass that still seemed like a dream. The prize money, managed carefully by Susan, had given them a new beginning. It wasn't a life of luxury, but it was a life free from the constant, grinding fear of poverty. Susan had found a job as an administrative assistant at a small, family-run bookstore, a quiet place filled with the scent of old paper and fresh coffee. For the first time in years, she wasn't just a housekeeper. She was Susan Miller, a woman with a respected job and a bright, talented daughter. Clara, for her part, was transformed. She attended Arthur Vance's prestigious dance academy every day, a place where her passion was not just accepted but celebrated. The initial months had been challenging. She was years behind the other students in formal technique, and the rigid structure of classical ballet felt foreign and confining. But what she lacked in polish, she made up for with an emotional intelligence and a raw, narrative power that her instructors had never seen before. Mr. Vance himself took a special interest in her, mentoring her privately, helping her fuse her innate storytelling gift with the foundational grammar of dance. She was learning to speak the language of ballet without losing her own unique voice. She no longer danced with the ghost of her great-grandfather. She danced with his spirit. The dog tags, now her most prized possession, were always with her, a silent reminder of the steel in her bloodline. One afternoon, Susan was browsing the internet during her lunch break when a headline caught her eye. It was from a gossip column, accompanied by a picture of a sullen-looking Madison Harrington. The article detailed how the Harrington family had quietly withdrawn Madison from the public eye after her disastrous performance on America's Next Star. The cruel joke they had planned had backfired so spectacularly that it had made them social pariahs. Mr. Harrington's business partners, wary of the negative publicity, had distanced themselves. The family had sold their grand estate and moved to a smaller, less ostentatious home in another state. Their reign as local society royalty was over, not with a bang, but with a quiet, humiliating whimper. Susan felt not a sense of triumph, but a quiet, somber sense of justice. That evening, Clara came home from school, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Vance chose me for a solo part in the spring showcase," she announced, dropping her dance bag by the door. "It's a new piece he choreographed. He said he wrote it for me." Susan wrapped her daughter in a hug, her heart swelling with a pride so fierce it almost hurt. "Oh, Clara, that's wonderful." Later, as they sat by the window, watching the city lights begin to glitter against the deep blue twilight, Clara leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "Do you ever miss our old apartment?" Clara asked softly. Susan thought for a moment. She thought of the worn furniture, the thin walls, the constant worry. "I miss how close we were," she said honestly. "But I think we brought the best parts of it with us." Clara nodded, her eyes on the distant, shining towers. They had been a joke, a charity case, a footnote in someone else's cruel story. But in the space of 1 week, with a single dance, they had rewritten their own destiny. Their story was no longer about survival. It was about soaring, and it was still just beginning. And that's where we'll end the story for now. What did you think of this journey? Have you ever experienced something similar, or discovered hidden meaning in an unexpected place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. I truly enjoy hearing your own stories. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. There are so many more inspiring journeys waiting to be told. Tell me, where are you watching from today? Remember, the people around us often carry extraordinary gifts we might never expect. Sometimes all it takes is someone believing in them. Until next time, keep your heart open to life's little surprises, and thank you for spending this time with me.